after the storm first the floor, and then we will move to the others. So Manja, sort of you monitor it a bit, and then you can take over the moderatorship if my connection. So did you hear me?
I didn't hear you that last part, Vicky.
No, I just mentioned that to speak, and then so that we will have time for questions and answers in the question and answer part, or we'll summarize it when we go to the question and answer part. So I start with a brief introduction and introducing you all, and then we will move from there. Okay.
We already opened the room for participants to come in. So
Okay.
we will wait for 8 minutes before we start.
Okay. The ones who take part in Facebook, they don't have interpretation, no? Okay. So all the that you let the
Buenas, ¿se escucha bien? Sí, dicen que sí. Listo, ponte por aquí.
Saco mi mascarilla entonces.
Ajá.
Buenos días.
Buenos días, Aurelio. ¿Cómo estás? Un gusto saludarte. Tu micrófono está en silencio. Conecta tu micrófono.
Buenos días, Francisco, a todos, a Vique, a todos los expositores.
Buenos días, Aurelio. Sí. Hello. Hello. Manja.
Yes, hello, I'm back.
So if you're there, my connection just get cut again. We'll start now, and if when it gets cut, you just take over the moderatorship, okay?
Yes, or maybe Joanne later. Because we
Yeah,
were
all right.
having problems also with our connection here.
Joanne,
I'm here.
Yeah, but
okay, great. In case our connections get cut, ask you to continue moderating because our now we can start. Good evening. All of you, I know we are in different time zones. Thank you very much to all the panelists for joining our webinar today. This is a webinar on the justice and remedy of indigenous peoples in the context of operations. No? As we all know, the issue of access to human rights forum is happening in Geneva. I don't know if it's happening now or later, but anyhow, we're doing in the context of the Forum of Business and Human Rights that's being held at the office. Be speaking to us about the situation of access to justice or remedy of indigenous peoples in the context of business operations. And we have very knowledgeable this issue. Introduce now our Sandra Creamer, who is a member of the board, the chair of the board of IPRI, and she is been doing work internationally in terms of he is the CEO of the National Aboriginal Women's Organization, as well as also of Indigenous Women, International Indigenous Women, FIMI, as well as the Seventh Generation Fund. No, so we will the situation of Aboriginal peoples in Australia and their situation in terms of access to justice. Mr. Francisco Cali, who is special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous peoples. He is Kachike elimination of racial discrimination, as well as the previous ambassador of Guatemala to the Germany, and he used to head also the human rights committee of dealing with racial. And we have who is from Peru, and he is the chair of FEDICIP, which is one of the indigenous addressing the whole issue of plus petrol in the. I also have been working with him several times in my the situation that they face in Peru in their community, especially in Leonardo Alvarado, the American Commission on Human Rights. In my term as the special rapporteur, he was one of my assistants who has been helping me a lot into looking into all the issues related to Latin America, but also in some of the thematic the themes that I addressed for consent and the right to consultation. An indigenous person also from Honduras. He is because we are Francisco. So I will let Pancho Cali speak first, so that for the floor.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And probably you didn't notice, but it's already the shutdown here. So now I am in my cell phone, and I am not sure how long it's going to last my battery. But anyway, thank you very much. I will change to Spanish.
Sure.
I will change to the Spanish because there are many Latin American brothers and sisters who are present in the webinar. So, quiero comenzar agradeciéndole a.
First of all, I would like to thank Vicky and her two organizations and all of the organizers of this event. As you all may know, in Asia, Latin America, among others, these are areas where we have seen negative impacts in human rights, more when we talk about companies and access to justice. They affect our way of life, the environment, our water, and this leads to a consequence to our health and our lives. The attacks that the defenders have to face put at risk their lives. These defenders are often attacked because they defend the land, they defend the environment. They express their opposition against companies and projects that affect their lands. The people who are opposing this, they sometimes have to face forced displacement and criminalization. They persecute the defenders. They restrict their freedom of speech, the freedom of gathering. These are human rights, civil rights, and these are sometimes attacked in the context of businesses. We see the relationship and sometimes invisibility of human rights. This should be our north more when we talk about COVID-19. We know that states should always protect human rights. They should prevent the violations of human rights. And if they cannot do that, they should prevent, mitigate, and remedy. They have the obligation to prevent the violations of human rights of indigenous peoples. This is a task that states should carry out. They should not allow external agents to attack human rights of indigenous peoples. If we talk about 169 ILO about indigenous peoples, which was adopted in 1969, we know that we recognize the rise of indigenous peoples. More when we talk about development and controlling this process, we want to control their development in the cultural and financial level. We have to include the interested communities in the execution and evaluation of the programs more when they affect them directly. For that right to become effective, the states need to prevent the violations of human rights. And how do they do that? They need to have access to their lands. And also they have to have the right of self-determination and autonomy. However, we see that this is not the case. We have concerns on behalf of indigenous peoples. Usually, because some projects are authorized in different places where they live or where they harvest their food. Usually, the state issues permits for companies to start their activities without even consulting the communities that are going to be affected. This means that companies have the power to do whatever they want without any control. So we also have to talk about the role that companies have regarding the respect of human rights. However, up until today, we know that they have a limited responsibility, social responsibility, and they do not always include indigenous peoples. And they don't talk about indigenous peoples as subjects of rights. However, and we know that they do not have binding weight. We need to have a framework. So we have the guiding principles of the UN, and in this document, we know what are the obligations of states and how can they reinforce companies to comply with these guiding principles. However, we still have some doubts about these principles. Sometime we should talk about these doubts. Now, when we talk about the responsibilities of the companies, these principles, we know that they talk about human rights. The very minimum would be to adopt the Human Rights Charter. And also they should embrace the 169 ILO when we talk about human rights regarding work. When we talk about international human rights, we know that indigenous rights are included within these rights. We also know that the IACHR sees the impact that it's different, but has a big impact on businesses within indigenous communities, more when there are projects that are going to be working and operating in lands where there are a lot of natural resources. The Commission also knows that the impacts are multiple and they are diverse. They are also very complicated and they are linked to other sectors where we see the vulnerability of some human rights. Sometimes they are forced to be displaced, their rights are not respected. So the states should make sure that these companies do not prevent these communities their access to food and a livelihood. We have to know that when there are going to be projects established in their lands, and these can lead to their access to food, we are putting their lives at risk. So we have had to make this a legal process, the access to lands on behalf of indigenous peoples. We see that sometimes the states do not have an effective response. So indigenous peoples have to access these two dimensions: access to justice and to the judicial systems. We have seen some cases where indigenous peoples have gone to constitutional law when companies have gone and have established themselves in their lands. These lands sometimes belong to indigenous peoples. Sometimes states want to access these lands that belong to indigenous peoples. And this means that indigenous peoples have to show their titles of these lands, and they have to explain why is this land so important. They have to explain what is the role of the authority in protecting these lands. Some authorities, indigenous authorities, have had to face security guards. They have had to face the military, and all they bring with them is their titles to show that they are the leaders of their communities. We have seen some progress of this subject. So I believe that the title of this webinar is very, but why? Because an elusive justice is something we see in the territory of indigenous peoples today. We see that they do not always have access to justice. So companies have to know that it is not enough to have a permit. They cannot make use of the natural resources in their lands. They have to have conversations with indigenous peoples because they are the owners of these lands. Thank you very much.
Is sorry, my connections are very unstable. But so did Pancho finish already?
Yes, I finished, Vicky.
To listen to the last part, but just to say that just to thank Ms. Francisco for contribution, especially situating it within the framework of international human rights standards, and also identifying the weaknesses, no, of the ensuring that indigenous access to remedy or to justice whenever they are disadvantaged, whenever they suffer from the injustices of security guards, no, of companies in further attacking or criminalizing indigenous peoples is indeed some in several countries. And for ask Aurelio Chino to say something about the concrete picture of how access to justice or the lack of access to Chino to take the floor, please. You unmute. Aurelio?
Buenos
Already.
días.
Okay,
Y
yeah.
bueno, la verdad que mi nombre es Aurelio.
Good morning. Yes, my name is Aurelio Chino. I am Quechua from Pastaza, and I am the president of FEDICEP. Also, I am from Puinamot, and I am the leader of my siblings from 3 different communities. From 2011, we have been
And since then, we've
struggling
been
against the
fighting
state. We have been
against
fighting
the oil
against
companies.
these oil companies. And this is
And this is a
very
very
worrisome for
worrying
us.
issue for us.
I would like to say something.
We have
Here in
serious
Peru, we have a
concerns.
political
In Peru,
crisis
we
nowadays.
are amid a very serious political crisis.
And these political crises are usually the main topic of our meetings.
And
In our country, we saw sometimes ministers quitting their positions, quitting their jobs. And
we've seen
that
how the
would mean that
political
we had to start all over again. And now this happened to the president, or rather the ex-president of the Peruvian government. And this is a big concern for us. I don't know if they are going to comply with this commitment that they have with us. And this is very, very concerning for us. Now, when I am talking to you and you are the special rapporteurs, for example, for Indigenous peoples, we would like to express our concern when we talk about access to justice and rights. I believe you know this topic very well. The access to justice is the access of any citizen. It's part of the rights. When one of your rights has been violated, the state has to guarantee that you have access to justice. We would like to have your support. I don't know how we can achieve this, how we can push. When we talk about the United Nations in 2011, we had a charter for obligations of the state and companies regarding their compliance with human rights. Vicky, I believe you know this problem very, very well. This is a problem that we brought up to the special rapporteur before. And now I know Francisco is in charge of the special rapporteur of Indigenous Peoples. Well, to be honest, I don't know. I believe that the states and companies have some obligations. They have to protect human rights. Their obligation is to respect human rights. And companies and states is to always try and remedy the rights that have been violated. And what we don't know is if this is going to happen or not. You who are the special rapporteurs, we would like to ask you for your support. And everyone who's here listening. I don't know how long is it going to take for them to take this responsibility on.
Cuando se habla de reparar los
When we
derechos,
talk about remedy of rights, we know that states and companies that are responsible have to reach to an agreement with the communities that have been affected to fix or compensate for the problems that they have created for them.
¿cómo remediar?
How can we remedy?
La verdad que durante los años de nosotros nos
Throughout the
preocupa
years, we have had this concern.
¿Qué hacer? No sé cargo ni si van a remediar o no van a remediar.
We sometimes don't know if we're going to get compensated, if they are going to try and remedy what has happened. Francisco, I would like to address this question to you because it has been like 2,000 sites that have been affected within our territories.
Y eso es una gran preocupación y
This is a big concern for us, and it is the state's responsibility. And now we see this new problem. We see the problem with Vizcarra, and we're going to have a new president, and they don't even know what the problems that we have in our territories are. And this is very concerning, very, very concerning.
Encima de todos los
Additionally, we
impactados.
talk about all of these sites that have been affected.
Pesados en
And we
otras
know that this is also a death sentence to us because of these heavy metals in our blood. And we see the pandemic also coming and hitting us as a world. How are we going to face these problems? These are problems that affect our health. This is very concerning. As the representatives we are, this is concerning for us. We really don't know how are we going to leave the world for our children, for future generations.
monitores.
I also would like to thank our monitors.
Interesante y importante.
They have worked very hard for all of these sites that companies were affecting, and they do not want to be responsible for it. These monitors, they were trained in fossil fuels, and they were working in these sites.
Eso a nosotros
Sorry, the interpreter apologizes. I cannot hear. Oh, it's back. We need to make sure that the state knows what is the condition of our land, of our territory. This is a subject of life. We're talking our lives here. We're talking about our lives. So, Francisco, I really want to ask you to take our side and try and push the Peruvian government for them to assume the responsibility and try and remedy all of these problems that they have caused throughout the years. All of these years that they have been extracting fossil fuels from the lands. So this is what I wanted to tell you today. You work within the UN framework, and you have contacts with all of these people. So I believe we need your support. I think Vicky knows this very well. Sometimes we had some meetings where we explained the concerns we had when we talked about these international businesses and our own state and how they violate our rights.
Francisco ya
And
también
now I believe that Francisco knows these problems. This is not the first meeting that we have with him. My colleagues have had explained these problems in our lands, all of the problems that we have had to face throughout the years when they have been operating in our lands. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to the panelists and the organizers. We just want to express our concern about these problems. We want to talk about the position that the state has towards indigenous peoples. Thank you. Thank you, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Aurelio. That the case of the indigenous peoples represented by Aurelio is very similar to so many other cases in the world. There are problems on access to justice. So we see indigenous communities very active in bringing their issues to different redress mechanisms, and until now they're still facing the same problems. So it's very timely, and we are very glad that we have the next speaker with us, Leonardo Alvarado. Leonardo Alvarado is a consultant of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. He is also a legal expert, and he has been working with the former UN Special Rapporteurs on Indigenous Peoples, with the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights in Honduras, and he has specialized on issues of land rights, consultation, free, prior, and informed consent, and has written and published on issues of implementation of international standards on indigenous peoples' rights. So we hope he can share with us how indigenous peoples, or how the work of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights be helpful to the issues of indigenous peoples in Latin America. So Lenny.
Hello, Manja. Thank you. I will also be speaking Spanish, probably more because of the institutional getting language that we use. Buenos días, buenas tardes a todas y todos los presentes.
Good afternoon, everybody. In name of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and the Special Rapporteur, she couldn't be here today, but also wanted to thank you for the invitation. Thank you to IPRI, to Victoria, to Mandia, to organize it.
El trabajo de la Relatoría de Pueblos Indígenas y cómo el Sistema Interamericano de Derechos Humanos.
Today, I'm going to talk about what we're doing and how useful is our work to fight for human rights. As you know, these institutions are one of the most important ones that monitor the human rights violations in the inter-American states. For us, the protection of indigenous people's rights is very, very important. And we've been drawing attention to this topic. We're putting this topic on the spotlight because many indigenous people in Latin America are facing the violation of their rights, and we want to monitor these violations and help them. We have different mechanisms in the Commission, and throughout the years, we've been receiving information and allegation against states and many companies' projects that are indeed affecting the rights of the peoples. So many indigenous communities have worked with us to be able to monitor these projects. We have several mechanisms to do that. And we want to avoid with these mechanisms the risk situations, we prepare also auditions in a legal framework, and we also write reports within this commission, Inter-American Commission. We've tackled many cases related to violations of human rights from companies and other third parties' actions that affect directly the human rights of the indigenous peoples. We've seen how in many cases, the state has been responsible of perpetrating these violations, together with private companies. And we've seen how also, for example, many people have disappeared or been harassed. In 1997, there was a report written in Ecuador, and we highlighted that the state had the responsibility of protecting human rights in this country regarding the oil industry.
Entonces, la Comisión Interamericana ha recibido varias denuncias a lo largo de los años que han resultado.
The Inter-American Commission has received allegations that have been taken to court since 1998, with the first case that we had in Nicaragua that resulted in a court case. And we've also been having several issues with land appropriations. Many cases have also been taken to court in Suriname, Ecuador, Honduras, and also in Argentina. So the Commission and the court have developed the rights of land owning from indigenous people. And they have also included issues such as spirituality or ancestral rights or other cultural aspects. So, thanks to these cases, the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights have described the obligations that the parties have on behalf of the indigenous people's human rights. So the states have several responsibilities that include the acknowledgement of the land, the demarcation, and also the respect of the land owning from the indigenous people. It is also stipulated that they should ask for permission, and that consent is a very important part to take into account. The states have to ensure that the human rights from indigenous people are protected at all times. Moreover, social and environmental monitoring have to be carried out by the state as well. So, the court has established, thanks to these cases that we've already experienced, that the state's obligations include the protection of human rights. So the state is responsible for guaranteeing that all the protocol and procedure has been carried out and that the human rights have been taken into account. We've also had different other cases, also in Argentina. And there's a very important case that highlighted the right of indigenous people to have access to natural resources. So for the first time, we have sentences to account the human rights access. That means when this is violated, this means not so, then these cases can be taken to court. Moreover, we've been also analyzing the companies thanks to other mechanisms such as writing regular reports. They have been asked to write reports on specific topics, such as, for example, indigenous peoples. Reports, we will see how harmful were and are the extractive industries. We've had many specific cases that prove so. And we've seen how many indigenous people have and also their lands. So the extractive industry affects them directly. We've gathered much information about this, and we've written a report from the Commission that describe the responsibilities of the states in regard of the companies as well. And these obligations include having an effective legal framework that prevents the violation of human rights. The state has also to monitor these industries and guarantee that indigenous people have enough information and enough access to the decision-making process. Moreover, the obligation is also to protect indigenous people, and in case of violation, they have to prosecute these companies.
En línea con estas recomendaciones, en línea con estos deberes, las recomendaciones a los estados siguen esa misma
So we
línea.
have, of course, some recommendations for the states regarding these reports. The states should have enough and efficient supervision mechanisms, also in other countries, not only in their own, and should develop effective mechanisms that allow indigenous people to have access to justice. In their own state and also in other countries in case that their citizens are abroad. So to finish with, business and human rights. This topic has also been tackled within the current situation. We've developed standards and conducted press conferences and developed other mechanisms that take into account the risk that the pandemic poses. Next year, we will also develop a report on self-determination, and we will tackle the importance of recognizing and acknowledging these concepts also in the business world. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Leonardo. That will give us an idea that the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights is doing a lot of work on issues of indigenous peoples. So we have to explore how to access these mechanisms with the Commission and see how they can work better for the rights of indigenous peoples in Latin America. There's a lot of questions for you, Lenny, but later on during the open forum. And I would encourage all participants, if you have questions, you just type them in the Q&A button, and or you can raise your hand so that during the open forum we can call you to speak if there is enough time. Our next speaker is Sandra Creamer. She is a Wani Kalkadun indigenous woman from Australia, the CEO of the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Alliance. She's a lawyer and adjunct professor in public health at the University of Queensland, and she's also the chairperson of the global board of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. So she will share the national situation of Indigenous peoples in Australia and in relation to access to justice, situation of Indigenous peoples under incarceration, and challenges and actions of Indigenous communities. So take it away, Sandra.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Manja. And first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the land that I'm on. I'm on the Durumba country land, and I'd like to acknowledge all the lands that Indigenous peoples are speaking from and watching from at this moment. One of the things that we know is that there are 3 pillars for the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. Those 3 principles are protect, respect, and remedy. In Australia, there's no human rights approach for Indigenous peoples put in place to self-determination under those UN guiding principles. One of the reasons that we have social issues here that affect Indigenous peoples is our prison. It's a high rate of, and that is because we have a high rate of incarcerations of Indigenous peoples in prison, mainly because of unemployment and issues to the tightness of our Native Title Act, where we are not allowed to gain an economic gain on our lands, and we are only given recognitions. So we have many mines on our lands, and we also have to negotiate for compensation or any sort of money benefits or for employment. Though these negotiations may go through, the other parties may not always act in good faith towards Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples. Indigenous offenders, as we know, for land are overrepresented in prisons, and that is the case here in Australia. The numbers are getting higher, and it's not because of serious offences, but it comes because of the poverty and unfair processes to land and accesses to trust funds for land. What's happening in Australia is that the government in some regions is closing down communities, and that is they are shutting off the power. They are not giving basic needs to communities because the governments want them to sign land agreements. And what happens is that those land agreements, the Indigenous peoples in some areas and some communities are not signing those land agreements because they do not want fracking or mining on their lands. So what happens in that case is they also want Indigenous peoples to sign a 99-year land lease. Aboriginal people don't want to be doing that. I've just come from one of the remote communities. out in the central desert where the English is a third language to a lot of the Aboriginal peoples out there. And a lot of Aboriginal peoples have money held in trust with land contracts as well as land lease for cattle stations. And they also have a lot of money held in trust for their art and traditional knowledges. So what happens is that with these trust funds, when it comes to land leases or their artworks or their traditional knowledges, they're held in trust by the government or some sort of corporations. If someone passes away, they're not informed about who the money or the trust money goes to. Indigenous peoples on lands don't know who then actually the land trust goes to. Every clan has a different, up in the Northern Territory in particular, lands are all subdivided, and those lands go to different clans. Different clans have different skin names. So each one of those lands and subdivisions of lands, they all have a different trust fund, and they all have different storylines. They also have sometimes different dialogues. So these are the complex issues of all of this is because of not a lot of them understanding English, not understanding their basic rights to trust funds, and they're not understanding the basic rights to their land land deals. So because of this, they feel that they have to go onto the welfare system. They then become homeless, they then become unemployed, and they don't know what is happening with their land contracts or their land deals. So as we know, the human rights lens to Indigenous engagements and human rights in the supply chain is not always happening and is not respected. There are businesses and corporations as well as governments are not demonstrating a commitment to the rights of Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people in this country, and they're not using the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a basic for their engagement, nor are they seeking the guidance of implementing and operationalising the state's duty to protect Indigenous peoples from human rights violations by businesses and corporations. The business duties to respect the human rights in their activities, and they have an obligation to ensure that we are not victims of violations by businesses and that we should have access to effective remedies. The principles based on the human rights of equality, protection of culture, and self-determination should provide us with a foundation on which we can build our own positions. That is regarding to the relationships between governments, mines, and corporations. We all know that's not happening for Indigenous peoples in Australia and as well as worldwide. The principles of the UN addresses issues such as recognition and respect, Indigenous involvements in environmental management and cultural heritage and protection. There is no free, prior, informed consent. There's no negotiations, and they're not included in the conversation. Therefore, the developers needs to respect us as Indigenous peoples, our integrity to our decisions making and our processes. The central requirement for those developers and miners is that they should know their obligations and our rights to free, prior, and informed consent because of the developments and the proposals and the damages that can happen to our land. One of the things is that the issues covered in these principles, as we know, are particularly important, where there should be legal and policy framework for resource developments on our lands, and they are not and should not be inconsistent with our rights as Indigenous peoples and our human rights. The principles should also assist in assuring equality and equity between ourselves as Indigenous peoples and our resource developments. That's not happening for Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people. So because this was not happening, there was a case that happened for in Northern Territory in one of our states, is that the elders in this community decided that they needed to take all of this to court because of the land issues. And as we know, with losing our land, we also lose our spiritual and cultural loss. So the elders in Timber Creek, they took the case to the court. It is set down a precedent here in Australia. It only happened 2 years ago, where they took the matter to the High Court, and they said that they had lost spiritual loss and cultural loss because of the infrastructure, such as roads and other things that were being built, or the damages on their ancestral lands, and that they were not in line with what the community wanted, Aboriginal community wanted, and they were not in line with what the community standards were. The court then awarded them $1.3 million in compensation for their spiritual loss. This has set a large precedent for Indigenous peoples here in Australia. I'm fortunate enough to be on one of the teams in writing the human rights framework for compensations for Indigenous peoples in the states that I've lived. So what we've actually done is we've looked at what the UN Declaration has stated that we should have, and we've also looked at what the human framework should be to our to free from form consent, and also to our money, also to our economic gain for money, benefits of money. So with this, we've gone around to each community, and it took us 6 months last year to go to different communities and to speak to different traditional people and ask them about what they felt that they should require in compensation. As we know, when it comes to large compensation payout in any sort of money benefits, governments are not going to pay it. So some of the communities actually said, well, for our spiritual loss and our cultural loss, you can't put a measurement on that. So what we want is health centres. We want to be able to have our cultural health centres where people can go and get counselling for the mental and trauma that they have suffered because of being forcibly removed from their land, and also because of the Protection Act that Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people were placed under. Traditional. We also must have legal information sessions on what their rights are when it comes to good practices in the courts. And we also must in particular look at when there are court sittings, so Aboriginal people in this country can have access to those courts and know the dates where they can actually put in their legal matters and submit any sort of applications that they want into the courts. Because here in Australia, because of the remoteness of some of the areas, as we know with Indigenous peoples in a lot of the countries, court sittings can be very difficult for them to attend to, as well as getting lawyers. So one of the things that we're looking at is how can our Indigenous people also have free legal advice or pro bono cases, pro bono lawyers to take into court for them. And one of the recommendations that we need to have a look at here in Australia, and what my recommendation is that it's very similar to our civil society over here that put in a recommendation to the Australian government. Also, we need to look at establishing stakeholders, advisory groups as a priority. We also need to make sure that there is a conduct of thorough consultation and effective baseline assessments to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. There also needs to be a development of a national action plan on business and human rights that contain specific forward-looking commitments and timelines and their allocated responsibilities of who is doing what. The other thing that there must be is a high level of transparency, and there also must be Indigenous people stakeholders' participations and consultation to show evidence-based approach and monitoring, and there also must be a review of mechanisms. This is very important for Indigenous peoples here in Australia, because otherwise what will happen is that we will continue to have the high incarcerations of Aboriginal peoples in jail because of forced removals of their land, lack of access to their trust funds and money, and also lack of unemployment and support for them to be living out in their communities where they can maintain their traditional cultures, language and storylines that give them the identity to Indigenous peoples in this country. And I think that it's very important that as Indigenous peoples, in sitting here and talking to you, all that we must know and understand what those principles are, and that we must continue to be a voice on that uniting guiding principles on business and human rights. Because as I had stated before, there are 3 pillars to this, and that is protect, respect and remedies. And we must ensure as Indigenous peoples that we are a collective voice, and that we keep on being a voice and implementing this and negotiating this, as well as taking some of these issues to court and seeking remedies what we have for what our rights are. Because as we know, mines, governments at times are not always acting in good faith and in the best interest for Indigenous peoples in the world. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Sandra. You are leaving us with a very strong message and a challenge for us to be more aggressive in our defense and in our assertion of human rights, of our Indigenous people's rights. And you also mentioned something that resonates in so many communities, Indigenous communities in the world, that in business activities that affect Indigenous people's territories, Indigenous peoples are usually not in the negotiations, and they are usually not included in the conversations. And this is a big challenge for Indigenous peoples in so many countries in the world. So we have already time for the question and answer. We have a couple of questions. I would like to call on Lenny first. If you're reading the Q&A, so that I will not have to repeat the questions. Have you been reading the Q&A, Lenny, so that I don't have to repeat the questions?
Hello, Manja. I read one question about the case in Argentina, which I answered. And also I know there's a question about business responsibilities. Bueno, para contestar a una pregunta sobre las responsabilidades de empresas.
I'm going to answer this in English. Talking about responsibility of companies and why the ICIHR has not declared anything about human rights in this subject. The system of the Inter-American Commission, among other human rights organizations, when we get a complaint about the violation of human rights, it's usually related with the obligation that states have, because the states are the one that ratify these charters. So for example, when there is a complaint in the Inter-American Commission, it has to be related to the obligation of the state, if the state has ratified our treaty. So if we talk about other documents that the Commission has issued, the Commission has already made recommendations for companies about what are their obligations. Also, there might be state responsibility on the actions of third parties. This means that if companies or third parties violate rights within their lands, they might be responsible. Also, if there is a bank or a company that is affiliated to the state, there is a straight relationship. So what do we see? The complaints go against states, and even if the state is not the one that violating, they might be responsible. For example, in banks that have a link with the state and they have had some activity that caused the violation of human rights, they might be responsible. I think that that answers to the question. I am trying to look if there are other questions.
And also very quickly, Lenny, are there any legal support in Latin America that indigenous peoples can access for their cases? Because there is this question in relation to a case in Chile where there's also a problem with consultation and with the free prior informed consent with them. And it's raised in the questions that the indigenous peoples lack the education, the awareness, and resources to access lawyers for their case.
Bueno, en este caso, pues, sí,
in this case, it depends on the organization that is supporting the indigenous peoples or the community. It depends. So I may be able to share some links on the chat box to see what resources there are through the Commission, what measures can be taken. I know that there are some funds on the Inter-American Court of Justice when the case gets to this stage, right? So that would be my answer. I am going to try and share that information.
It does require the Inter-American Court has provided or does promote the fund for indigenous peoples to be able to present their cases or obtain some kind of compensation for cases brought. But in general, it does require alliances with academic centers and other people who have lawyers who help bring cases. I don't know if there was another one, sorry.
Okay, thank you. We have a question to Aurelio. What legal actions have you taken in relation to your case with Plus Petrol? And can you also share the status of these actions that you have taken?
Yeah. Bueno.
Well, hello. I would like to answer to this question. What have been the actions that we have carried forward as indigenous peoples? Well, we have taken the following actions. First, all the problems that we have to do with the state. When we brought our case forward to the justice and it didn't go through, we went to the Constitutional Court. We had to show the damages in the environment that this company caused. But we had a response that was not satisfying. It seemed like they didn't care about it. So the only option that we had was, as representatives of our communities, we had to inform. After we did this, we prepared a mobilization. We brought our spears and we wanted to defend our rights. We mobilized a struggle. We wanted to make sure that all the authorities in our country saw this concern that we have about our lands. Our land was getting polluted, our water was polluted, our animals were polluted. So we couldn't sit and wait for the state to have the will.
Escuchándome.
Rapporteurs and panelists who are here, I want you to know this. We stood against this, and this was not the will of the state. We trained our own monitors. Why? So that they could become the vigilantes of our territory, the defenders, so that they can see what the operations of this fossil fuel company was causing. We made the state responsible in 2015 with a bill. We wanted to see a remedy to the problems that they caused. The state, together with the company, they reached to an agreement. They signed a contract, and we had no representatives of our indigenous communities. So if we talk about these two entities, the company and the state, we blame them. They are responsible because it is their fault that we are in this situation. They are giving us a death sentence. I also had to travel to foreign countries. I went to the UN one time to present this problem in my country. They gave me 3 minutes to talk about 40 years of fossil fuel exploitation. Even in the UN, we see discrimination. How can they give me 3 minutes to talk about 50 years of problems? This is another issue that I am analyzing within the UN framework, for your knowledge. Afterwards, I traveled to Switzerland. And with all of these problems, afterwards I had to travel to Amsterdam. And again, I had to present my complaint about Puinamut Cuatro Cuencas with Plus Petrol. And we are looking for ways. Who and where are we going to go? Who is going to hold this state accountable for these problems? And the company that is producing all of this pollution. We are sadly looking for ways to access justice. We want them to be held accountable for all of these damages. When I arrived to Amsterdam, I showed my complaint. And then I sat down with the authorities of that country. I was asking for their support. I was asking for them to help us have justice. How is it that these countries are going to allow these companies, this company that it's basically a criminal, to be in their countries? Is it allowed by the laws in their countries? These were subjects that I brought up because I wanted them to support us and help us get our justice done. And not because we're indigenous peoples, we have no rights. That's not the case. We have just the same rights as every other person in this world. I know everyone has rights. We're all equal. We're all humans, and we are all living in this world. We want to live free. We have the right of living in an environment with no pollution and have access to the resources that are in our lands.
Es a todos los expositores.
So this is something I wanted to say to all of the panelists. We're not waiting for the state to have the will to do something. We have to do it ourselves. We have to carry out the struggle. We have to have the technical support. And of course, we have to face several challenges. They talk about laws, they talk about rules, regulations. And we say that if the rules and regulations were there, were established, we would not be sentenced to death. We would not have heavy metals in our blood. This is very clear for us. And this is what we're demanding. We demand this to the authorities. We want respect. We want our rights to be respected. In las cuatro cuencas, we are in Puenamut. We want our rights to be respected. So thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak a second time. Thank you.
Thank you, Aurelio, for sharing your experience in trying to access justice or trying to access remedies for your community's case in relation to Plus Petrol. It would also be good to hear from the other speakers if they can share briefly some good practices in terms of Indigenous peoples being able to access justice. Sandra shared some cases earlier, but if there are some other cases that we can share in terms of access to justice, that would be good. And since the special rapporteur, Francisco Cali, is no longer here, I would like to ask Sandra if you can also answer the question on what are the weaknesses and strengths of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in relation to Indigenous peoples, because you mentioned earlier about the national action plans. Maybe if you can mention three of that. But before you answer, I'd just like to, before you answer these questions, I'd just like to call also on some attendees to gather the questions, and then we'll go one round among the speakers to answer these questions, plus the questions that will be raised by attendees. Please be very brief. I'd like to call on first on Juan Gonzalez. Juan Gonzalez.
Hola, buenas. ¿Se escucha?
Yes, hello, can you hear me?
Sí, sí.
I am going to speak in Spanish.
No hablo otro idioma.
I don't speak any other language.
¿Me escuchan?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sí, sí, go ahead.
No. Sí, continúe.
Escucha en español. I speak Spanish.
Sí, me escucho.
Ah, ya. Discúlpeme.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. I am part of the Cahuascar community in Chile. We are at the southern part of the country. And whenever the state summons us to be part of consultation processes, as Indigenous peoples, we know that it is our obligation to be part of these processes. So what we do is we participate in the process. We write all of our concerns, the things that we need to protect, the ancestral lands, make sure that they are compliant with environmental laws. So we write everything down. But what has happened to us? What have we noticed? What do we need as Indigenous peoples? Let's not only talk about remedies, we have to set precedents, because these consultation processes are sometimes they satisfy us. However, after the process, it is not like we have ended, it continues. So what do we need? We need to review these processes. We sign treaties, we sign agreements, we have bills, we have laws to validate these processes. And what happens after? When we completed the process, we don't see this become a reality. We don't see what we wrote down. There's always something that is missing. We always see the state getting all the benefits or the company getting all the benefits. So we see that this is a mistake. Many of our people do not have the resources to access to justice. So we lose our means to defend our people when we're signing a treaty, or for example, when we have a bill and they are asking for something and we comply with these parameters, but then afterwards we don't have someone who makes sure that what we agreed to gets completed.
Trying to make do of the remaining time we have.
Bueno, mi gran pregunta es.
Yes, my question was, how can we set a precedent? So we want to see a precedent on the indigenous consultations after the process. This can be used for us to be able to make our agreements, make them reinforceable. How can we do that? So, are you able to understand? I am sorry, I cannot express this in any other language.
Yes, no problem. Muchas gracias, Juan. So our next, the next person would be Magdalena Farin. Please, very brief, and if you can please go direct to the questions. Thank you. Okay, or if she's not yet ready, maybe Juan de Dios Garcia.
Usalahanim kaskacha ina raminat tenimit chekwahin junts mashikchiwe. Buenos días a todos, yo pertenezco al pueblo mayachi de Guatemala y tengo varias preguntas, pero veo que es muy limitado el tiempo. Quisiera hacer un cuestionamiento más que todo. Yo quisiera ver hasta qué punto el sistema de Naciones Unidas pudiera tener un poquito más de dientes en este caso. Cabalmente lo que hablaba el hermano chileno, pues obviamente es lo mismo que pasa en todo el mundo. Sabemos que hay una red de criminales, en este caso empresarios, inversionistas y gobiernos, pues han hecho enorme daño a los pueblos indígenas. Y no existe una manera para poder salir de esta situación. Por eso decía cómo el sistema de Naciones Unidas pudiera tener un poquito más de dientes para poder, digamos, sancionar o castigar a los países que violan esos derechos humanos. Hasta hoy en día, el sistema de Naciones Unidas tiene, digamos, sus sanciones o sus recomendaciones. No son sanciones, hacen sus recomendaciones y ahí nadie puede, digamos, ningún país del mundo acata esas recomendaciones. Entonces, creo que la situación está de esa manera. Los bancos multilaterales y financian a las empresas entonces violan esos derechos humanos con el permiso de los gobiernos. Entonces, ¿de dónde vienen los fondos que manejan los bancos multilaterales? Obviamente viene de los estados. Entonces, el mismo estado está violentando los derechos humanos dentro del mismo estado. Entonces, esa es la situación y quisiera ver qué ha hecho el sistema de Naciones Unidas para tener un poquito más de fuerza y que no únicamente llegas a recomendaciones que está dando hasta ahora.
To reinforce these commitments, make them binding.
Thank you so much, Juan. Then we go to Magdalena. Just very briefly, please.
I don't have questions. Thank you.
Thank you. How about Cesar? Cesar Monroy. Cesar, if you can unmute yourself, we will be able to hear your question. No problema.
Sí, buenos días.
Sí, buenos días.
Sí, yo hablo español, yo soy de Guatemala, del departamento de Totonicapán, y vengo representando el Consejo Ancestral de los 7 municipios. Y mi pregunta es, ¿se han hecho consultas aquí en Guatemala? Y a través de se hacen consultas todavía que son vinculantes, pero al final no respetan.
Nowadays, we have consultations that are supposed to be binding, but at the end of the day, we see companies going and polluting our rivers, our lands. A few years ago, we had the special rapporteur visiting us, and nothing happened. So we want to know how can they support the indigenous peoples better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will go back to the speakers to answer the questions that I raised earlier, plus the questions that were raised by the participants, the questions that you would want to respond to, and also to give your last message. So I would like to go first with Sandra.
Can you hear me? One of the things I just want to say is that with those guiding principles, as we know, they do not set a global standard. So what I'm saying is that in this is that the world where companies are encouraged, they're not obliged to respect our human rights. And also the other thing is that guidance is just not enough. Then there needs to be a lot of scrutinized by the governments to apply all of the principles. So one of the things while I was just listening to everyone, I just done a quick research and I just looked at that the International Labour Organization has created a landmark new treaty protecting the rights of domestic workers, meaning that the new ILO treaty contains detailed provisions requiring governments to regulate private employment agencies and invest complaints. And that means that it stands for human rights, and despite the oppositions of business and governments. And also what happens is that the guiding principles aims only for the global standards, but we know that those guiding standards are only partial answers. And one of the things that I'm saying is have a look at the new treaty that has the new amendments that have been put into the ILO. And as we all know for Indigenous people, and I'll say this, we really have to take and challenge things in the legal system. We never had, as Indigenous peoples around the world, we lost all of our rights. But within the last up and coming years, we are gaining our rights back. It's a hard fight. We may lose some of these cases and we may win some of these cases. By challenging and winning some of these cases, we do set down precedents around the world for globally for Indigenous peoples. And as I always say to people, always try and challenge in the legal system, because that is where we can make the changes. And as we all know, we lost everything. Our land, we lost a lot of our languages. We've been forcibly removed, but we are one of the largest human rights network and movements in the world. There are over 500 million of us. So what we need to do is continue challenging in the legal system. One precedent will make a change for all of us. Thank you all very much for listening. I have really enjoyed and learned a lot from everybody in this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sandra, and I couldn't agree more. So I'd like to call on Aurelio next.
Bien, bueno, la verdad que
Yes, thank you. Thank you, all the panelists and fellow delegates from Chile and elsewhere in Latin America. Thank you for listening today. I would like to encourage everyone to continue. We continue raising our voices as Indigenous peoples, because if we don't stand for our rights, other people are not going to worry about us, and let alone the governments and the authorities. They are only thinking about extracting resources. I wanted to thank you, everyone. Thank Francisco, Vicky, and all of the panelists that were here today.
muchas gracias a ustedes.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I know that we will see each other again.
Thank you so much also, Aurelio, for sharing the situation of your community. And we are with you in your struggle for access to justice. I would now call on Lenny.
Hello. A través del chat he compartido vínculos.
Yes, through the chat box, I have shared some links for the Inter-American Commission. You can check the reports on different subjects. We have the report on natural resources and lands, 2009, also the one on indigenous peoples and business operations in 2016. I talked about this report in my presentation, and we have a newer one about the Amazon jungle. We also talk about consent and self-determination, and we try to move forward in different fronts. So when we talk about agreements, we know that the agreements should be complied with. If we have observations and we have reports about this, we know that these have to be binding and it has to be complied with good faith. Also, if we see the sentences in the Inter-American Court, if we talk about Sarayaku, which I previously mentioned, when we talk about good faith, we have to make sure that states and businesses do not create divisions within the society. This is part of the good faith and the trust that has to be there. We have to develop standards and have the hope that the nation adopts these standards to create precedents, to set precedents. Whether we talk about Chile, Guatemala, and other countries, this has to be the case. These concerns that we have and that we have heard from some of our fellow delegates is that maybe the hope that this can be used, that this can be used to have more treaties in Latin America, and maybe we can use these treaties. So what we want is to look for support from international lawyers, use these standards in the case that we're mentioning, for example, and also we need to recognize that this is a challenge. We have limits in international law. Sometimes we do not have the capacity in the United Nations to send people to make states comply with these treaties. But what have we seen? We need to empower indigenous peoples through these instruments, through ILO 169, through the Inter-American Commission. They have to be able to use these instruments when they interact with the states. They need to be empowered and they need to make their rights be respected. If we see these alliances, maybe we can have relationships with multilateral banks, we see sometimes that the pressure against the bank, for example, gives positive results. Sometimes they withdraw their support towards a specific project. If it is proven that there has been the violation of human rights, sometimes the banks decide to move aside. So these are strategies that indigenous peoples can use. So with the information that I have shared in the chat box, I hope that I can shed some light on how can you create alliances with different sectors. And also, as mentioned before, and the purpose of my presentation was the instruments and the standards that we are developing, and have hearings and have treaties to be able to monitor and follow up on the progress of this subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lenny. And that's a good way to end this webinar, that indigenous peoples need to be further empowered, and we can do one way to do this is to make them have more access to justice. So we'd like to thank the speakers for giving their time and giving their insights on this issue of access to justice and indigenous peoples' rights. We would like to thank all participants for attending this webinar. And we would like to inform the participants further that the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International also has a legal defense and sanctuary fund that supports indigenous peoples who are facing criminalization, attacks against their human rights, and impunity. So you may visit the website of the Indigenous Peoples' Rights International. It is on the chat box. There's also the email there. You can also contact us through Facebook or Twitter, but better to do it through the email, and also check more information on the website. We also would like to thank our co-organizers for this webinar, the Office of the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, and also the IP Rights Program of the University of Columbia. And we would also like to request you before leaving to please answer a survey form or leave a feedback on the chat box. Thank you very much, and we really appreciate your presence during this webinar. And we hope to further engage with you in the coming months and in the coming years.